In the 21st century, Sleeping Beauty is a children's classic, a tale of curses, spinning wheels, and a princess kissed awake by true love. But what if this story, so often dismissed as a simple fairy tale, hides something much older and far stranger? Beneath its velvet layers lies a mystery stretching back over 4,500 years, long before castles and fairies, before even the written word in many parts of the world. Why has this story endured for millennia? What does it really mean to fall asleep for 100 years and to be awakened? It might surprise many people to learn that the version of Sleeping Beauty most of us grew up with is actually one of the youngest. The story as we know it, a princess cursed to sleep until awakened by a kiss, was shaped in the last few hundred years. But its roots go much deeper, into the soil of ancient myth and folklore. To understand how far back this story goes, we have to leave behind castles and spinning wheels and travel back thousands of years into cultures that believed in gods, fate, and powerful women who fell into enchanted slumbers. The first place to look is not in Europe, but in the ancient world. Civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, and the Norse cultures of the far north. These societies didn't write fairy tales in the modern sense, but they did tell myths, powerful symbolic stories that helped explain life, death, the seasons, and the mysterious forces that shaped the world. And in many of these myths, we find something that sounds familiar. A woman who is cursed or fated to fall into a long, unnatural sleep, or something like it. One of the oldest stories that resembles the Sleeping Beauty pattern is the myth of Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war. Around 4,500 years ago, this story was written on clay tablets in cuneiform, one of the first writing systems in human history. In the myth, Inanna descends into the underworld, seeking power or transformation. But once she enters, she is judged, killed, and her body is hung on a hook. She remains there for 3 days and nights, not exactly asleep, but suspended between life and death. Eventually, she is brought back to life and rises again. While this is not a fairy tale, it's a powerful ancient myth about a female figure who enters a state of deep stillness and returns transformed. The core idea is already there: descent, sleep, or death, and awakening. A similar theme appears in ancient Egyptian mythology. The goddess Isis resurrects her husband Osiris after he is murdered and dismembered. Osiris becomes a god of the dead, sleeping in the underworld, but still alive in a sense. These are not fairy tales, but they show an important pattern in ancient storytelling: the idea that sleep or death is not the end, but a gateway to something else. And often, it is a woman who moves through that gateway. In Greek mythology, we find another key figure, Persephone. She is the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. Persephone is abducted by Hades and taken to the underworld. There, she becomes his queen and is forced to remain for part of each year. During this time, the earth goes cold and barren, a mythical explanation for the seasons. Persephone's return from the underworld each spring is like an awakening. Her time in the dark mirrors the long sleep of Sleeping Beauty, while her return brings life back to the world. These ancient myths were not just entertainment. They were ways of understanding nature, fate, and the mystery of human life. The idea of a beautiful woman in a state of suspended animation, touched by fate and brought back to life, was already deeply rooted in human imagination long before Europe's fairy tale traditions began. But how did these ideas travel through time and turn into the story we now call Sleeping Beauty? As the classical world faded and the Middle Ages began, myths didn't disappear. They changed form. In the early medieval period, stories were often told through oral tradition. One famous example from Norse mythology is the story of Brynhild. She is a Valkyrie, a warrior maiden who defies Odin and is punished by being put into a deep, enchanted sleep. She lies on a mountaintop, surrounded by a ring of fire, until a hero named Sigurd braves the flames and awakens her. The details are different, but the core is once again familiar. a powerful female figure cursed into sleep, awakened by a brave hero. This story was passed down in the Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems compiled in the 13th century, but based on much older oral stories. As we move into the High Middle Ages, storytelling becomes more formal. Written tales begin to appear in Europe, often influenced by both Christian and pagan traditions. Romantic tales of chivalry and destiny flourish. The idea of the sleeping maiden starts to blend with courtly love, where the idealized woman is passive, beautiful, and waiting for a noble man to rescue her. These values would become central to many fairy tales later on. But it wasn't until the Renaissance that something close to Sleeping Beauty was written down in a form we'd recognize today. In the early 1600s, an Italian writer named Giambattista Basile published a collection of folk tales called The Tale of Tales. Among them was a story titled Sun, Moon, and Talia. In it, a young woman named Talia falls into a death-like sleep after pricking her finger on a splinter of flax. She is not awakened by a kiss, but by something far more troubling. A passing king finds her, cannot wake her, and ends up assaulting her in her sleep. She later gives birth to twins, one of whom sucks the splinter from her finger, waking her. The story is disturbing by modern standards, but it reflects a rawer, older version of the tale. It shows that the idea of a cursed sleep and magical awakening was already fully formed. This version is important because it connects the ancient mythic elements to the literary fairy tales that followed. It also reflects how the story shifted with the times, blending older ideas of fate and sleep with newer and often darker ideas about gender, power, and agency. Later, in the late 1700s, Charles Perrault adapted this story into a much softer version in Histoires ou Contes du Temps Passé, also known as Mother Goose Tales. Here, the princess pricks her finger on a spindle and falls into a deep sleep for 100 years, just as foretold by a fairy. She is awakened by a prince's kiss, and they marry. Perrault's version introduces many of the elements we now associate with Sleeping Beauty: the fairies, the curse, the spindle, and the romantic awakening. A century later, the Brothers Grimm published their version called Little Briar Rose. It's similar to Perrault's, but with some Germanic folk influences. In their version, the kiss is still present, but the tone is darker and more symbolic. The Grimm brothers were interested in preserving what they saw as pure folk traditions, and their version reflects that. It's less courtly and more grounded in deep-rooted cultural themes. As the story of Sleeping Beauty moved into the modern era, it didn't just survive, it transformed. The core elements remained, but the meaning and tone evolved with each generation. New authors adapted it, reshaped it, and sometimes twisted it to reflect changing values, fears, and fantasies. What began as a symbolic myth of sleep and rebirth became a mirror of social expectations, especially around gender, power, and love. In this section, we trace how the tale changed, who changed it, and why those changes mattered. By the time Sleeping Beauty reached the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe had undergone massive cultural shifts. The Renaissance had revived interest in classical myths, but the Enlightenment introduced a new desire for order, reason, and social structure. Fairy tales, once full of raw magic and wild transformation, began to be rewritten for polite society. Charles Perrault, writing in late 17th century France, played a major role in this shift. His version of Sleeping Beauty turned the disturbing violence of earlier tales into a story fit for the royal courts. Gone was the assault found in Basile's Sun, Moon, and Talia. In its place was a gentle kiss, a destined prince, and a romantic awakening. Perrault also added more domestic elements: fairies who give gifts at a christening, a queen mother who turns out to be an ogre, and a focus on marriage and family. His version made the story safer, and in doing so, made it more widely acceptable. But it was not just about softening the content. Perrault's adaptation also reflected the values of his time. Women were expected to be passive, modest, and obedient. The princess, in his tale, does very little. She is cursed, sleeps, and is rescued. The prince, on the other hand, is brave, curious, and active. This dynamic became central to many later fairy tales and helped shape what audiences came to expect from stories about love and destiny. In the 19th century, the Brothers Grimm added their version, called Little Briar Rose. Like Perrault, they removed some of the darker aspects found in Basile's tale, but the Grimms also had a different goal. They were not writing for the court. They believed they were preserving the true voice of the German people. Their tales had a more rustic, earthy quality. In Little Briar Rose, the curse is softened. The 13th fairy wishes that instead of death, the princess will fall into a deep sleep. After 100 years, a prince arrives and awakens her. The kiss is still there, though it is often debated whether it appeared in the original or was added later. These two versions, Perrault's and the Grimm's, became the foundation for almost all later retellings of Sleeping Beauty. But something else was happening beneath the surface. As the story became more popular, it also became more symbolic. The princess was no longer just a character. She became an ideal. She represented beauty, innocence, purity, and silence. She did not act. She waited. This version of femininity became deeply embedded in Western storytelling. And it wasn't just in books. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, new forms of media emerged: theater, opera, and eventually film. Each one brought Sleeping Beauty to new audiences and gave it new layers of meaning. One of the most famous adaptations came in the late 19th century, when the Russian composer Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky created his ballet, The Sleeping Beauty. It premiered in 1890 in St. Petersburg. Tchaikovsky's version was based largely on Perrault's tale, but the ballet format emphasized beauty, grace, and visual spectacle. The princess, Aurora, is a vision of elegance. Her long sleep becomes a moment of still perfection, frozen in time until awakened by the prince. The ballet was not just entertainment, it was art, designed to impress the upper class and celebrate Imperial Russia's refinement. As the ballet gained popularity, so did the idea of Sleeping Beauty as a visual fantasy. This would set the stage for its most famous transformation in the 20th century, in the hands of Walt Disney. In 1939, Walt Disney began early development on what would eventually become Sleeping Beauty, though it would not be released until 1959. Disney had already seen massive success with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937 and was eager to adapt more classic fairy tales. But Sleeping Beauty was different. It was darker, slower, and more symbolic. The production took nearly 2 decades, making it one of Disney's most ambitious early projects. The animation style was unique, inspired by medieval tapestries and Gothic art. The backgrounds were richly detailed, the characters stylized, and the tone more serious than earlier Disney films. The result was a visual masterpiece. But the story itself followed the now familiar formula. Princess Aurora is cursed by the evil fairy Maleficent to prick her finger on a spindle and fall into a death-like sleep. The good fairies manage to soften the curse. Aurora sleeps, and Prince Philip fights through thorns, defeats Maleficent, who turns into a dragon, and awakens Aurora with a kiss. Disney's version cemented the story in popular culture. For many people, this is the definitive version of Sleeping Beauty, but it also solidified the story's core conflict in a very specific way. Good and evil were clear. The heroine was passive, the hero was active. Love was simple and magical. These themes became deeply associated with the story, and with the expectations placed on girls and boys in the real world. What's often overlooked, though, is that this version was created in a specific cultural moment. The 1950s in America were a time of strict gender roles. Women were encouraged to stay home, raise families, and look beautiful. Men were expected to be strong, decisive, and heroic. In that context, Sleeping Beauty reinforced a powerful and limiting message about what love and life should look like. But not everyone accepted this message. In the second half of the 20th century, especially in the 1960s and 70s, feminist scholars and critics began to question stories like Sleeping Beauty. They pointed out the troubling aspects: a heroine with no agency, a romance that begins without consent, and a message that rewards silence and obedience. These critiques opened up a new way of looking at the tale. Writers and filmmakers began to respond. New versions of Sleeping Beauty started to appear, some satirical, some subversive, some radically different. One example is Angela Carter's short story, The Lady of the House of Love, published in 1979. In this version, the Sleeping Beauty figure is a vampire, trapped in a cycle of seduction and death, longing for release. Carter's version flips the tale on its head, making it about power, desire, and freedom. In more recent years, retellings like Maleficent, released in 2014, have reimagined the story from the perspective of the villain. In this version, Maleficent is not evil, but misunderstood. The story becomes one of betrayal, revenge, and ultimately redemption. The true love's kiss does not come from a prince, but from a maternal figure. It's a radical shift that challenges the old fairy tale logic. At its surface, Sleeping Beauty may seem like a straightforward fairy tale. A beautiful princess, a magical curse, a brave prince, and a happy ending. But under that simple plot is a complex web of symbols and meanings that have made this story endure for over 4,000 years. From ancient myths to modern media, Sleeping Beauty speaks to something deeply human. It reflects the way we think about time, transformation, danger, safety, and most of all, the role of women in society. To truly understand the story's long-lasting power, we need to explore the symbols inside it, the sleep, the curse, the kiss, and the awakening, and how they've been interpreted over time. One of the most important symbols in Sleeping Beauty is the long sleep itself. This isn't an ordinary nap. It's a magical, total stillness that pauses life. Everything in the kingdom freezes, time stops. The thorns grow around the castle, isolating it from the world. In many ways, this sleep is a kind of symbolic death. The princess isn't dead, but she's not alive in any meaningful sense either. She's suspended in time, untouched by change or decay. In myth and psychology, this type of sleep often represents a transition. It's a pause between stages, a time of transformation. In ancient myths, heroes often travel to the underworld or fall into deep sleep before returning changed. In many cultures, sleep is seen as a doorway between life and death, or between ignorance and knowledge. For the Sleeping Beauty figure, the sleep can symbolize the shift from childhood to adulthood, from one identity to another. The long slumber is not just a rest, it is a waiting period before rebirth. This idea is also connected to nature. In older agricultural societies, people depended on the seasons. Winter was a time of stillness, of cold and sleep, while spring brought warmth, growth, and new life. Sleeping Beauty mirrors this natural cycle. The cursed sleep is winter, and the awakening is spring. The tale reflects the belief that even in the darkest times, renewal is possible. This natural symbolism may help explain why the story was so powerful in early farming cultures, and why it continued to feel meaningful even as societies changed. Another powerful symbol is the curse itself. In most versions of the story, the princess is cursed by an older woman, usually a fairy who was insulted, forgotten, or left out. This detail often feels small, but it has huge symbolic weight. The curse comes from an older, powerful woman who feels disrespected by a society that values youth and beauty. In that way, the curse reflects a deeper tension between generations, between the aging and the young, between power and vulnerability. It also speaks to the fear of female power. In many fairy tales, older women are portrayed as witches, stepmothers, or evil fairies. Their magic is threatening, their wisdom is dangerous, and their presence is often seen as a problem. This pattern shows up again and again. In Sleeping Beauty, the older fairy curses the baby girl out of jealousy or anger, and in doing so becomes the source of all conflict. This sets up a contrast between two kinds of femininity: the young, passive, beautiful girl and the old, active, dangerous woman. The story seems to favor the former, suggesting that beauty and silence are safer than knowledge and power. But the tale doesn't just comment on age, it also deals with fate. In many versions, the curse is unavoidable. The parents try to stop it. They ban spindles, hide the princess, isolate her. But it still happens. No matter how much they try to control her life, the moment comes when she touches the spindle and falls asleep. This has led many readers to see Sleeping Beauty as a story about destiny. Some parts of life, it seems to say, cannot be prevented. This fatalism appears in many ancient stories, where even the gods can't change what's been written. At the heart of the tale is the moment of awakening, usually caused by a kiss. This moment is often presented as the romantic climax of the story, but the meaning behind it is more complicated. On the surface, the kiss represents love, or at least affection, but it also raises questions. If the princess is asleep, she cannot give consent. In earlier versions, this detail was not seen as troubling, but in modern times, especially with growing awareness around consent and agency, this part of the story has drawn criticism. Still, in symbolic terms, the kiss often represents something larger than romance. It is the spark of life, the moment of transformation. In religious or spiritual contexts, it can symbolize divine intervention, the soul being called back to the body. In psychological terms, it can be seen as the moment when the conscious mind reawakens, when the individual becomes aware and active again. The kiss may be physical in the story, but symbolically, it stands for change, energy, and rebirth. These symbols, sleep, curse, kiss, awakening, have allowed Sleeping Beauty to carry many different meanings across cultures. In some interpretations, the story is about puberty. The spinning wheel, the pricked finger, and the blood all point to the first menstruation. The sleep represents the pause between childhood and womanhood. The awakening becomes a symbol of sexual maturity and readiness for adult life. This reading views the tale as a coded way to talk about a girl's transition into a new stage of life. Others see the story as a reflection of historical attitudes toward women. The passive princess, waiting to be rescued, became an ideal during times when women had little power. The story told girls that their role was to wait, to be beautiful, patient, and silent until a man chose them. In this way, Sleeping Beauty helped reinforce social norms about gender roles. But at the same time, the tale also showed that women had hidden strength, the power to survive a curse, to endure for 100 years, and to return. Across cultures, similar stories appear. In Chinese folklore, there are tales of maidens who are placed into long magical slumbers. In Persian literature, enchanted sleep is used as a plot device in romantic epics. In Indian mythology, there are figures who sleep for hundreds of years as part of divine cycles. These stories may not be directly connected, but they share the same basic idea, that sleep is not just a rest, but a journey, and that awakening can be a powerful return. In the modern era, Sleeping Beauty continues to influence how we tell stories. It shows up in films, books, advertising, fashion, and even psychology. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, used the story to explain the idea of the anima, the unconscious feminine side of a man's psyche. He saw the sleeping princess as a symbol of a hidden part of the self that needed to be awakened in order for a person to become whole. Feminist thinkers have both criticized and reclaimed the tale. Some argue that it promotes harmful ideas about women and love. Others have found power in rewriting the story, giving the princess agency, making her the hero of her own journey, or removing the prince altogether. These retellings show how flexible the story really is. It can be adapted to reflect new values and new understandings of identity, relationships, and power. Sleeping Beauty is not just a fairy tale, it's a cultural mirror, one that shows us how we think about time, transformation, and human connection. It began as a mythic structure, evolved into a romantic legend, and continues today as a source of both inspiration and debate. Its core themes are universal, but the way we understand them is always changing. And that is the real magic of Sleeping Beauty, not the kiss or the castle or even the sleep itself, but its ability to grow with us, generation after generation. Over the course of thousands of years, Sleeping Beauty has transformed from ancient myth to modern icon. Its story has crossed cultures, changed shape, and taken on new meanings, yet it has always returned to the same timeless ideas: the power of transformation, the tension between fate and freedom, and the deep human hope that even after long silence, there can be awakening. Far from being just a fairy tale, Sleeping Beauty is a story written into the very structure of how we dream, fear, and believe. And it still has more to teach us,